Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Cross of Ciaran by Andrea Matthews, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1 Kingdom of Connachta Eru, 432 AD. Ciaran stumbled along beneath the twisted canopy of blackthorn shrubs, their prickly branches entwining with those of the hawthorn to form a mystical passageway. Though only a dim gray light pierced its knotwork, intermittent flashes of lightning broke through the tangled vines to sketch eerie patterns across the moss-covered path. His robe caught on the spiny bramble, and he stopped for a moment to free his sleeve, but a sharp shove from behind thrust him forward once more, the sudden movement ripping a jagged hole in his fine linen robe. His temper flared, and he turned to object, though it did no good. Another quick jab to his shoulder spun him back around and thrust him out into the lakeside clearing. Slender stone columns stood in a semicircle around its perimeter, each one facing the sacrificial altar. He rested his hand against the one closest to him, steadying himself as the reality of the situation washed over him in a wave of nausea. There would be no escape. As if in agreement, a bolt of lightning ripped across the horizon, followed by a crash of thunder so loud it caused the breath of it to catch in his throat. The goddess was angry. Out of nowhere, thick gray clouds had formed to conceal the morning sun and cast ominous shadows over the secluded enclosure. The urge to fall prostrate before his goddess mother gripped his innards, tearing at his stomach with a fiery knife, but he could not find it within his heart to do so. A black-robed cleric propelled him farther into the temple confines, forcing him to his knees beside another of the slender stone columns. The decision to kneel had been made for him, though it was an empty gesture on his part. Trying to retain his composure, he gazed around the quiet glade. Towering thorn bushes encircled the clearing, concealing the sanctuary from the outside world, and providing a perfect setting for worshipping the goddess of their Tuath. The bile rose in his throat, for he knew the requirements for admission all too well. Entry to its sacred confines was only granted to those within the priesthood, and those about to die. Ciaran clenched his fists to keep them from shaking. His priesthood was all but lost, the consequences for his conduct clear to him before he ever acted. He closed his eyes for a moment, a vain attempt at calming his nerves. As a priest of the First Order, his actions had been a betrayal of the goddess. No other punishment could be considered. Yet, even as the impending storm foreshadowed his destiny, he hoped in vain he could somehow alter the outcome. If not for himself, then at least for the young woman who even now was being laid upon the ancient altar. Though he could barely speak, he forced the words to his lips. "Masedu Twal he begged the stoic forms that stood before him. "Please, spare her, for she has done nothing to you." The chief priest, Rudan, turned sharply, his eyes glaring with a deep and relentless rage. "Then denounce her and claim her for the goddess," he said, his voice strained, but guarded. For a moment Ciaran stared at the elder priest. A chilled breeze caused him to shiver, for his robe clung to his body, torn and covered with sweat and dried mud. No, he could not speak the words the man demanded of him. Instead, he looked away, shaking his head. Rudan strode forward, his face flushed and angry red. He reached out, tearing open Ciaran's robe and ripping the bronze cross from his chest. "Is this at the root of your betrayal?" He spat the words, his lips turning up in a snarl of disgust. Ciaran bowed his head, his eyes fixed on a clump of damp earth. What argument could he offer in his defense? Just days ago he too would have been horrified by his actions. Now he found himself unable to deny them. Taking a deep breath, he looked up to face the chief priest. "How can I change that which I have come to believe?" The words came out in a whisper. Even as he spoke, he felt as if two large hands were tightening around his throat. Rudan's countenance hardened, his hands balling at his sides, but before he could respond, another of the High Council stepped forward and touched his arm. "Allow me to speak with the lad," Domhnall said, his deep cerulean eyes filled with pain. "He has been under my tutelage since he first came of age, Perhaps he will accept my counsel now. Rudon glanced at Domhnall, and after a moment's hesitation gave a curt nod. Try your best as Ciaran, though I fear even your guidance will fail. Domhnall acknowledged Rudon's warning with a dip of his head before turning to face Ciaran. Please, my son, heed my words. His tone was firm, but held a gentleness that served to comfort rather than reprimand. Think of what it is you are saying. You were chosen by the goddess to be the father of priests, but you have defiled yourself by lying with this unsanctioned woman. He laid his hand on Ciaran's shoulder. Accept this new god as your own if it is your wish, but do not betray your goddess in doing so. See the folly of your actions? Forsake this sorceress and beg your mother's forgiveness. Ciaran could not look the man in the eyes, and so gazed out across the lake instead. Tabran or master, but in all good conscience I cannot, for I love her more than life itself. In spite of his conviction, he couldn't suppress a twinge of shame for the distress he'd brought upon his noble mentor. I truly am sorry, master, but no matter how hopeless my plight, I can give no other answer. With his jaw firmly set, he turned his attention back toward Domhnall. His heart was breaking, but his voice held strong and steady, firm with a love born from the depths of his soul. I have taken Aisling for my wife, and my Lord and God has blessed that union. I will deny neither, for no matter the cost. Enough! Rudon shouted. He caught Domhnall by the arm, and for a moment Ciaran thought he saw a shadow of regret flash across the chief priest's stark expression, though it was gone as fast as it had come. Pushing past his friend, he came to stand before Ciaran once more, determination etched in the creases of his forehead. It is clear you have no remorse for your treachery, and so you shall be held accountable in accordance with our ancient laws. He turned toward the altar, and a fresh vengeance resounded in his voice. First, however, we must appease the goddess of our Tuath, lest she send her punishment upon us. This woman has defiled a chosen priest destined to serve only the lady herself. It is she who must give her life in recompense. No! Ciaran wrenched his arms free from his captors. With a strength fortified by a deep, unwavering love, he shoved the priest hard against the stone pillars. The elaborate granite altar stood steps away, the soothing waters of the lake lapping on the shore behind it. If he could reach Aisling, they could escape to the gentle water. He was a strong swimmer, better than any who stood to judge him, and a small boat sat anchored no more than a few strokes from the shore. The two fledgling priests struggled to gain their footing, and Ciaran darted forward. He reached out, his fingers brushing Aisling's hand. She turned to face him, a single tear running down her cheek. Though the rapid rise and fall of her chest revealed her anguish, her face glowed with an internal peace, and a tender smile touched her lips as she caressed his cheek. Excuse mo croix tu, she whispered. But before he could return her words of love, a strong arm caught him under the chin, knocking him to the ground. Having regained their balance, the two stunned clerics took hold of him. With whispered curses, they hauled him to his feet and dragged him back to the standing stones, forcing him to his knees once more. Heavy iron chains hung from the weathered granite, and one of the young men clamped them hard around Ciaran's wrists, tethering him securely to the pillar. Aisling sprang up, reaching out toward him, but a nearby priest shoved her back down on the granite altar. Though they had not bound her, she made no attempt to flee. Even she knew any attempt would be futile. He'd been a fool to think he could escape his fate. All he'd done was anger his fellow priests and bring more disgrace upon himself. Rudon's lips were pressed so hard together they almost disappeared behind his graying beard. Let them do to him as they wished, but he must fight to save Aisling. I beg you, master, release this innocent. She has done nothing. It is I who have corrupted her. I called upon my authority as her priest and demanded she lay with me. Do not seek to deceive me, fledgling. You have not yet attained the skill. Rudon spat the words, contempt dripping from each syllable. All in the Tuath know of your status as a chosen child of the goddess. Yes, master, and so she would not refuse my command. Rudon came to stand before him once more. With a claw-like grip, he clutched Ciaran's shoulder and pulled him to his feet. Visible once more, his lips curled into a sinister smirk, one filled with scorn and disgust. Do you think me a fool, priest? A clap of thunder echoed off the hills. Rudon glanced toward the distant rumbling for a moment before returning his gaze to Ciaran. Offer her to the goddess, then. Beltane is almost upon us. Choose her as a vessel for the lady's child. Ciaran cast a glance in Aisling's direction. Her chestnut locks lay unbound and strewn across the altar, and her soft alabaster thigh peeked through a tear in her saffron gown. She turned her head and shook it ever so slightly. It was enough. Try as he might, Ciaran couldn't make the words form on his lips. Either way, Aisling would meet her death, whether now or 9 months hence after she bore the goddess's child. His decision made, he bowed his head, fixing his gaze on the base of the altar. Unable to do what the high priest demanded, he bit his lip and willed his tongue to remain silent. I thought as much, and so you have sealed both your fates. Rudon turned and strode toward the altar. With a slow, methodical movement, he picked up the ceremonial dagger and raised it high above Aisling's chest, chanting a solemn dirge. One by one, the rest of the High Council gathered around her slender form, echoing Rudon's incantation in rising cadence. Domhnall cast a final glance at Ciaran's direction, shaking his head before adding his voice to the somber chant. Ciaran strained against his metal bonds, the cold, unyielding iron cutting into his wrists, holding him fast. Then Domhnall stepped forward and Rudon handed him the blade. No, it couldn't be. Ciaran tugged all the harder, the unrelenting manacles rubbing his flesh raw and sending searing pain up his arms. Yet he could do little but watch in horror. Domhnall hesitated a moment, his gaze settling on Ciaran, his silent words echoing in Ciaran's mind. I have taught you well, Moshenbeek. Do you not recall the lessons you learned at my knee? Who but your chief tutor could ready this woman for the trifold death that will befall her? Ciaran gasped for breath. 3 deaths, none but the final one killing her, unless... He closed his eyes. He must speak to his master privately so not even Rudon could hear, but had he learned well enough. Please, master, have mercy. Make your aim strong and sure. He opened his eyes to see the pained expression on Domhnall's face. For a moment he hoped he had succeeded, but when Rudon spun around, his cheeks flushed with anger. Ciaran knew he had failed to keep the message between himself and his teacher. He looked into the chief priest's eyes, sending another silent plea. Please, by the goddess of Artuath, take out your wrath on me and send Aisling swiftly to her mother's bosom. He hoped his words would please Rudon, that he would take them as a form of remorse. Anguish clutched his bowels as he waited. Aisling's whispered prayers a gentle murmur beneath the rhythmic chants of the priests. Then Rudon gave a subtle nod to Domhnall's direction, and his teacher's face relaxed a bit. Ciaran eased the tension on his shackles. Domhnall would be quick about it. Though she would die 3 times, it would last but moments. A sob caught in Ciaran's throat. Domhnall turned to stand over Aisling's trembling form. Do not fear, Alimbeen. Before long you will be in Tir na Nog. I am the Lord's child, not yours, Aisling said, her voice strong in spite of the underlying tremble. And before long I shall be in heaven with him. I am not frightened, for you hold no power over me, nor does your goddess. Domhnall hesitated once more, but Rudon had lost his patience. Be about your task, Asanchera, before the goddess of the Tuath sends her wrath upon us all. I have been as lenient as I dare. Ciaran's heart ached. There was no doubt in his mind his teacher would do what he must. No matter how Domhnall regretted the actions he must take, he was above all a loyal priest. With a gentle hand he lifted Aisling's silken tresses, slipping the silver wire around her neck. Once the cord was securely in place, he anointed her chest with the juice of the mistletoe. Aisling let out a small gasp as Domhnall took the belt from her lean and cut it in 2, using the first piece to tie her hands together and the second to secure her feet. Panic flooded Ciaran's senses. He was running out of time and options. Regardless of his beliefs, he had to put a stop to this savage ritual. He'd tell them what they wanted to hear, agree to take Aisling's body as a host for the goddess's child. Doing so would keep her safe at least until the babe was born. If nothing else, it would gain them the time they needed to escape undetected. Though such thoughts were no more than romantic folly, he desperately wanted to believe the tale his heart dared to whisper. He was just about to relent when fate stepped in and his eyes met Aisling's. "Faith, my love," she mouthed the words without any sign of fear. "I live in Christ. Do not despair." For the first time in his 29 years on the earth, Ciaran wondered if he had the courage to do what he must. One desperate word of repentance could save them both, but it would deny all that he had come to believe. Somehow Aisling had sensed his torment and gently reached out to calm his troubled soul, even as her own death grew near. She had spoken at his most vulnerable moment, begging him not to falter, and so he would remain true to the words of love and faith he had professed just hours before. With the songs reaching their zenith, Ciaran tried once again to sway the priests from their determined course. "I beg you, let this innocent woman live. Send her away if you must, but do not punish her for my infidelity. The guilt is upon me, and it is I from whom the goddess will demand reparation." Yet, in spite of his entreaties, not one priest turned from their duty. His voice strained to capacity. He swallowed the bile that stung his raspy throat. He could do no more than watch as Domhnall plunged the dagger deep into Aisling's chest. A cry rose from her lips, her bound hands clenching, but the high priest did not linger. He turned the wire around her slender neck, twisting it quickly. She gasped for the last few breaths of air, but not once did she waver, not even when they carried her half-conscious body to the boat and sailed out across the lake. Ciaran's vision blurred as they tied a stone around her waist and threw her face down into the water as a sign of her disgrace. Broken-hearted, he slipped down along the smooth column, its iron fetters of no more concern to him. Kneeling once more, his head hung in grief. He felt as if his very soul had been torn from him. The tears broke forth from their tentative barrier, streaming down his cheeks, yet there was no anger left, no hate. Only a deep, abiding sorrow permeated his aching heart. He waited in silence, staring out at the crystal lake as Aisling's limp body sank below the rippling waters. Once he had worshipped there, purified himself in its gentle waves, but now it was nothing more than a tranquil lake, a place to bathe and swim, and for Aisling, a place to die.